My mother immigrated from Austria to the United States in 1936 when she was 11 years old. This is a story of that journey and what occurred in her life after she ended up in Minnesota. She was the only child of her father Rudolph's second marriage. Several of his children from his first marriage, and most notably Franz, were already living in America.
Well, I was born in Ottenschlag, which is in Upper Austria, a little ways north of Linz, along the Danube. And my father's name was Rudolph. When all his children finally left home to go parts unknown, he married my mother, whose name was Maria Rommel, in 1924. My father considered himself kind of a gentleman farmer. Well, that didn't bring in any money, so they lost the farm during the First World War. My brother Franz came over to Austria, and he bought this little farm in Ottenschlag for my dad. In the meantime, my sister Crystal had lost her husband to lung cancer, and he had a child named Helen. And they came to live with my father after my mother died. And also in the meantime, Fanny was in Vienna learning to be a restaurant cook. When my father's wife died, then he asked her to come home again.
So there they all were on a small farm, the two sisters, Fanny and Crystal, Helen, her daughter, the father Rudolph, and his wife Maria. This is a picture of Rudolph and his family taking on the farm before my mother was born. Her mother is the one with the white cow on the left. Helen is about 2.5 years old and is holding the hand of Rudolph. Maria Rommel had been born in 1884, and this was her first marriage, even though she was already 40 years old. Other than that, not much else is known about her. She had been a housekeeper before she married Rudolph, and she was Roman Catholic. She died giving birth to my mother on May 14th, 1925.
They had just a midwife, no doctor, and she was in her 40s already, so when she hemorrhaged, they didn't know what to do about it.
After her birth, things got all mixed up for Mother because no one bothered to tell her the truth about her birth. This is a picture of Rudolph, Crystal, Helen, and my mother as a baby.
The reason for that was because Helen called my dad grandfather and her mother mother. So that's what I called my dad was my grandfather, and my half-sister Crystal was mother. And nobody told me any different until I was 9 years old and Helen's mother passed away. And all at once they told me that she was my sister and my grandfather was my father. And they never told me.
Mother's sister Fanny married her new husband Joe and left for America. That left Rudolph, Crystal, Helen, and Mother in Altenschlag. Things didn't go any better financially with the second farm, and eventually it too had to be sold. It was decided that they should move to Vienna, the capital of Austria.
When Franz came over to a second time to Austria, he sold the farm, and Crystal bought a candy store in Vienna. And we lived quite a ways from the candy store, so she had some relatives of her husband's run the store, and that didn't work very well.
They moved into an apartment house in Vienna that had 2 bedrooms, a den, a kitchen, and a bathroom. The better of the 2 bedrooms was rented out for extra money. These are pictures of my mother and Helen playing in Vienna. Mother is the one holding the stick.
We're making a snowman. And I had, this thing was used when you boiled the clothes, you know. And this was in the yard in the old house, apartment house yet too. And we'd had a terrible, terrible rainstorm, and so we decided we were going to go wading. We stuffed our dresses in the underpants. Yeah.
Crystal lost her candy store and got a job washing clothes for a sister of the president of Austria, Mr. Miklas. This woman was to later help the 2 girls out of Austria. Crystal worked very hard because in addition to washing, she still had to do housework and 2 little girls to take care of after she got home. Around 1934, she got very sick with what was later diagnosed as cancer and wasn't able to work.
Well, she was in this hospital, and she was quite sick. And they had put leeches on her back, they could, I don't know what they were trying to do, but anyhow, she asked her dad to come and see her on a certain day, and while he was there, she turned towards the wall and died. So she knew when her time was coming.
This left Mother and Helen essentially alone, especially after Rudolph died in 1936. Through all this, Mother continued her education. In the 3rd grade, she was attending a public school, but the nuns decided to send her to the convent school when she entered the 4th grade. This is one of her report cards from the 3rd grade in 1934-35. In the convent school, they had to wear a uniform over their dresses. It was black with a white collar that could be changed when it got dirty.
This was in a convent out in the country, and they had all kinds of peach trees and apple trees and plum trees, and I was told not to eat them because they were green yet, but Martha didn't listen and kind of messed up the bed that night.
This is the certificate from her first communion in 1933. A family friend, Herr Kudelwasser, had been appointed guardian after Christel's death. This is a picture of her and her husband. Before Hitler invaded Austria, Herr Kudelwasser shot himself because he was sure that SS was coming after him. He had been part of an anti-Hitler group and thought he would be imprisoned. Years later, Mother still corresponded with Frau Kudelwasser and received this letter from her in 1946. She had managed to survive the war, although she doesn't elaborate in the letter on any of the hardships she must have suffered. Her letter begins with the greeting, Kuhn Ubl. There were bright spots in Mother and Helen's lives, even as wards of the state. In June of 1936, the Chancellor of Austria decided to sponsor a group of underprivileged children for confirmation along with his son. Through the sister of President Miklas, whom Christel had worked for, Helen and Mother were also chosen. This is a picture of the president's sister, who was Helen's sponsor. Helen's back is to the picture.
So the state actually confirmed us, and it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. And they took us to a park where there was rides and things, it's called the Prata. And the biggest Ferris wheel in the world is there, and it's still there, actually, because we saw it from our cabin. Dad and I were there. And I had this huge, huge balloon that it had to have a net around it for some reason. Well, Mrs. Kudelwasser went and got us from the Prater, and we had to go in the streetcar, and somebody had a cigarette and popped my balloon. So that was the end of that.
In the summer of 1936, Rudolf Kuhn passed away at the old folks' home and was buried in a plot with Christel. Now there was no one to look after the 2 girls. Luckily, the relatives in America took action and sent money for their passage. Mr. Kudelwasser took care of all the legalities, and they left on a train to Hamburg. From Hamburg, they took the ship Europa to New York City. The trip took 6 days, which was fast for those times, but once there, they ran into some difficulties. Louise, Mother's half-sister, had to come on board to get them, but they couldn't leave the ship because the immigration officials at Ellis Island wanted a guarantee that they wouldn't be a burden to the state. They had to agree that they would settle with the only relative that didn't live on the East Coast, and that was Fanny and Joe Dursberger in Minnesota. Mother's half-brother Franz again came to the rescue and told the authorities that they would be his responsibility. Because he worked for the city of New York, they were released and taken to Marie, Emmy's mother's apartment that night. There they met Emmy for the first time. After a few days in New York, they boarded a train and traveled to Pittsburgh, where Mother's sister Hedwig and her family lived. From there they continued on to St. Paul and then to Sandstone, Minnesota. There they were met by Fanny and Joe.
We got off the train and we stood there like a bunch of dummies, and Joe happened to be standing there, and of course I didn't know who he was, And he said, "Na," he said, "is this Helly and Mata?" And Louise said, "Yeah, that's the girls." And then Fanny came up, and of course then we had to hug and kiss each other and stuff. And on the way, they had a Ford truck, and we had to sit in the back because there wasn't room in the cab. Joe had given a neighbor a ride, and we went up to this hill and stopped, and there was this tar paper shack, and Helen and I said, "Is this where we're going to live?" But it turned out it wasn't, so. And we finally got to the house, and they had just built that house a couple years before, so it was really nice.
The two girls shortly had to start school in a small one-room schoolhouse close to Grindstone Lake. Their teacher, shown here from a recent reunion, started them out slowly on picture cards, and by late winter of that year, they were ready to join their regular grade.
The day after we got to Joe and Fanny's house, they told us we had to go to school the next day. So we did, and of course we were scared, and we got into school, and all the kids were looking at us and laughing, and our teacher was Miss Wahlberg, and she's the one that taught us English, and I was supposed to be in 4th grade.
Meanwhile, daily life on the little farm wasn't much fun for the two girls because there was so much work. In between haying and taking care of the cow herd, there was the gardening, housework, and canning. They were happy when the time came to go back to school because they wouldn't have to work so hard. It was in the midst of the Depression, and not much money came from the families on the East Coast. Mother, however, found a way to make a chore into play. She and this dog named Rex were good friends.
In the fall and early spring, we could turn the cows out into other people's hay meadows, but you had to herd the cows so they wouldn't eat the haystacks. And that was my job. And I'd carry a 5-gallon pail of water out into the field and pour some water down the gopher hole, and the dog and I'd catch gophers all day.
Their education continued in this small country school for the next several years. Later they took tests and both got into the 8th grade at Sandstone High School.
You had to take tests in the 8th grade to go to high school in those days. The teacher said, "Well, I got some extra exam papers here. Why don't you see what you can do?" And lo and behold, I passed them all. So just like that, I was in high school.
Helen finished 2 years of school, but Mother had to quit at Christmas in the 2nd year. The reason given was that a girl didn't need all that schooling. That summer, Helen started working in Sandstone for a family named Klein. They own a big department store where the Coast to Coast is now. When Mother was 15 years old, she bought a bike.
When I was 15 years old, I got a bike, a Schwinn bicycle. I think I paid about $50 for it. I was pretty proud of it. I started going down the driveway, and of course I didn't know anything about riding a bike, and I ran into the barbed wire fence. And I still got scars on my legs from it. Yeah.
The year Mother turned 17, she went to work for the same Mr. Klein's sister in Minneapolis. But she didn't like them, and soon switched to a job at the Shriners Hospital in the diet kitchen.
I got a job at Shriners Hospital, and I had to take care of the kitchen in the girls' ward and in the boys' ward. And that was fun. I had a good time doing that.
She earned $60 a month, plus room and board, and had a lot of fun with the other employees on their days off. Later that same year, she would make one more attempt to live with Bonnie and Joe.
In the summertime, then Joe's varicose veins were bothering him so much that they asked me to come home and help with the work. Well, that didn't work either because Fanny was so jealous because I was with Joe helping him out. So we got into a big tiff about that, and I left again.
A friend of Mother's was talking about going to California, and when she told her sister Louise, she talked Mother into coming to New York instead.
So one day I just decided to do that, but I didn't get paid at the hospital because they were a day late, so I took off with just my bus ticket and no money for lunch or anything. So I rode, I think it was 2 nights and a day on the bus, and I didn't have any food. But I got there, and I was at the wrong bus depot, and of course Emmy didn't know which one. she finally figured out I wasn't at that one, so she come and got me at the right one. And I stayed with them until the next spring.
She stayed in their apartment and got a job at DePina's department store on Fifth Avenue. Mother really liked New York, and because Emmy knew her way around, they went to a lot of places on their days off. However, the sled doesn't look like it's going very far. Meanwhile, World War II had started, and our father got drafted. Before he reported to Fort Snelling and before she left for New York, he and Mother had decided to write. Their correspondence continued throughout this time and progressed from friendship to romance. They got married as soon as he was discharged. These pictures are from their wedding.
Well, the top pictures is there's Annie and brother called Gordy Jr. and Marilyn and Sophie and Donald. That was the kids at my wedding. And my best friend, Ines Kronbeck was her name, and I called her Cronny all the time. She was my maid of honor, and Paul's brother Alan was the best man.
The original arrangement was that my parents would work Grandma and Grandpa Ubl's farm, but things didn't work out, and in September of 1946, they bought Charlie Borchart's farm through the FHA. There were 2 rooms upstairs and 2 rooms down. There was no indoor plumbing.
Well, we had electricity, and that's about all. We had to carry the water in and out, and the slop pail was one of the worst things you ever want to live with, because it stunk no matter what you did.
They had a fluorescent light in the kitchen that had to be turned on before the electricity was in full use by farmers doing their evening milking.
So if you didn't turn the fluorescent light on before you went in the barn, it wouldn't come on, because it needed that extra electricity just to come on. So if you didn't turn it on and forgot about it, then you didn't have any light in the house. So I had a floor lamp that I used, and it was supposed to be in the living room, so I put it in the kitchen. And one time I insisted on locking the house when we went someplace, and I forgot the key, so we had to climb through the window. Well, the lamp was sitting right there. I forgot about that, so we climbed through the window and crashed the lamp, of course. So that was the end of the key to the front door when we went someplace.
They worked their farm together, but things were very tight. Rather than buying a car, they made a purchase they were most proud of, this manure spreader. Previously, they had had to spread it by hand. What a step up. Mother was pregnant by that September, and Christy was due in January, but she went into labor early and actually had Christy at the end of October.
We had neighbors. It was Minnie and Henry Borchardt, and she was a very nice lady. We didn't have a car yet. I had gone to the doctor in Sandstone all the time, and because I was really sick the first couple months when I got pregnant. The night that Christy was born, Grandma used to tell me how you could have pains, which is from eating a pickle and stuff. Well, I'd eaten some pickles, and when I was milking I think we had 2 cows in, and I was milking the cow, and I kind of had a stomach ache. Well, that was the pickle, of course. About 2 hours later, it was not the pickle anymore. Henry and Dad were grading up the driveways because they were in such bad shape. Well, it poured cats and dogs that night, and so our road was nothing but mud. And Dad called up Henry and asked him if he would take me down to Pine City to the hospital because I was having awful pains. So we had to drive across the field because they couldn't use the road to get to the main road. We went about, probably 3 miles, and Christy was born in the car. Somebody else's car. I thought the baby was dead, but then I felt her against my leg, and Christy stayed in the hospital till the first week in January, until she was just about 5 pounds, and then we could take her home.
After that, she had Margaret the next year. These are some of the Christmas cards from their first years together.
Well, when Margaret was little, I decided we had to have a picture on a Christmas card of the girls. So I didn't have a flash camera, just had one of those old Kodak box cameras, you know. And I set them in front of the big window we had on the south side, and I pulled the shade down so that it wouldn't bother, the sun wouldn't bother him. And I said, now, you look at me, because when I pull the shade up, the sun's gonna bother you. So I made him look at me while I took a picture of him. And that's what happened. I got a picture.
I was born in 1952, and a year later, David. For 8 years, there were only the 6 of us. Then in 1960, Jeff was born. And in 1962, Cindy, and then Stephen. Throughout this time, one of the friends of the family had been Leonard Noby. He had actually lived on the farm for a number of years. He and Dad had been friends since their childhood.
They kind of grew up together. The families would visit back and forth because they were both German. He was a bachelor, and there's nothing better than he liked better than to tease Dad about something or other. And he'd always say, "Well, I tell ya," and then he'd start his long stories. And he liked our kids. Years later, I found out that he was bragging in the neighborhood about the good kids that Paul and Martha had, because they never got into any trouble. And some lady that I know still talks about it, how perfect my kids always were. Leonard never talked silly with the kids. He was always talked decent, you know. He never treated the kids like they were nothing. He always made a big fuss about them. I always liked that about him. Yeah, one year Leonard and Dad decided they were just going to make wood, which turned out all right because they both liked to work in the woods. And he had a pile of logs there that was at least 50 feet long. And I got some pictures of the first piece they sawed. He had a great big pile in sawed logs, and wood had to be split, of course. And he had a neighbor kid come and help him split the wood. His name was Puddin', they called him. And any time he slowed down splitting wood, then Dad would say, "Well, I bet you some friend of yours that I don't remember his name, but I bet you he could outdo you with splitting the wood," and then he'd get a fresh start, and nobody was going to do better than him.
Their farm continued to grow, and with all the kids, their house needed new additions. What had started out as a 4-room house grew and grew again.
Around 1959, we decided that our family had outgrown our house because we only had 2 bedrooms upstairs and two rooms downstairs. So we built on the west side of the house another bedroom downstairs and a bathroom, which was the first bathroom in the house I ever had. And I thought I was really Mrs. Got Rocks there. And Dad was working on the road down in Stillwater, and this carpenter we had, he worked on the house during the night, at night. And so every day I had to clean up the sawdust from the house building, which was no fun. And the carpenter we had was kind of a shirty relation of mine. But he wouldn't do anything I told him to do, so I had a teensy-weensy closet in the bedroom downstairs and a huge bathroom. So I put the washer and dryer in the bathroom.
And then added on to the house again.
Now then we added on to a couple years later, I guess, added on to the east side of the house and had a great big living room, and my kitchen and dining room were huge. And that was kind of nice for a change. And it's all burnt up now.
Mom and Dad later both retired from the farming business.
We decided to sell the farm, and we sold it to Butch Mosted, and he's into big horses. and he liked the farm. Well, while he was living there, he somehow the house caught fire and burned up, and now he's built a new house there. And he's got part of it is a birthing barn for his horses.
But kept part of their farm on the hill and built another house.
We had a double-wide dynamic home up on the hill west of the farmhouse, and planted a bunch of trees, and I really liked it there. We had a nice yard, and 17 acres, I believe it was. And the trees grew up real fast. In no time we had a beautiful windbreak. And lived there until we had to take Dad to the hospital for dialysis 3 times a week, and it was getting too much for me. So we looked for a house in Pine City and ended up with this townhouse I'm still living in. And I have very good neighbors.
They also traveled a great deal and even made a trip back to Vienna. Mother has never lost her enthusiasm for work, despite taking a few minutes leisure now and then. And now she has time to play with all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren that have come along.
Sì, lo so che non c'è luce in una stanza quando manca il sole.